We have our last session of the day and this part of Mainnet, and we're super excited to be joined by a number of great speakers, including Mr. Joe Lubin. I believe Dieter from Codify just joined us. We have one other speaker who will be joining. Nick from Consensus will be joining right now. All we've talked about for the past couple hours is what it means what is the mainnet, what it means to bring the mainnet into your organization, some of those roadblocks that people have had to go through to overcome to make this a more smoother transition. We just heard about plenty of integrations and the idea of baselining and making this even simpler for your organization, for your company, or for you as the developer looking to make this happen. And to wrap up, we want to talk about the business aspect of this, what this all means, and now how do we make a business out of this, and how do we bring this all forward into our applications and where we go from here in the future. So without further ado, Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to stay on. I'm going to turn off my video, stay on for just a moment to make sure I can get Patrick, our last speaker, in here. For all those that are listening, again, thank you for continuing to stay on. Please drop any cues, questions that you may have in the chat. We'll try to get them answered at the end. Joe, I wanted to let you know I loved these sweatshirts. It's awesome. Saw it in the earlier session that you got. Nick, it's all yours.
Kyle, and welcome, Joe and Didier. And Kyle, you're working on getting Pat in the queue. So by way of introduction, I'm Nick Kritikos. I'm one of the baseline co-leads, and I lead global alliances and channels at Consensus. Prior to joining Consensus, I did 18 years at Oracle and 3 years at Microsoft, helping many enterprises implement enterprise systems of record, CRM, HCM, contract management, supply chain management, all kinds of things that used to centralize the world. And long story short, I'm trying to fix that. So we are joined today by Joe Lubin, who many of you know and probably needs no introduction. But for those of you that may not be familiar with Joe, he started his career really with robotic vision and expert systems before jumping into Goldman Sachs, moving from Goldman Sachs into hedge funds, before he retired to pursue a music career, and was so inspired by Vitalik's Ethereum paper that he came out of retirement and banded together with a small group of individuals to set up the EF and launch the Ethereum mainnet. So, in his role, he's literally had the front seat to the evolution of the platform. And in many ways, it might be said, he knows how to use it and he knows how not to use it. So we're very fortunate to have Joe join us today. He's consulted by enterprises, governments, non-government agencies, decision makers worldwide. And it's a pleasure to have you, Joe.
Thanks, Nick.
Didier is currently the Codify Group CTO, and Codify stands for Commerce and Decentralized Finance. He began his career as a Java engineer implementing enterprise systems before he took a couple tours of duty in some big famous banks, PNP Paribas and HSBC. He co-founded Trade Quorum before joining Consensus, where he now leads many of our large blockchain projects with strategic clients like Comgo, Covantus, and others. As I mentioned, he is currently the Chief Technical Officer for our Commerce and Decentralized Finance suite of products. And there's really no one better than Didier to talk about where we are for modern enterprises and blockchain implementations. So thanks for joining us. And hopefully we've got Pat coming. I'm going to go ahead and introduce him anyway.
You can intro him, I think.
Yeah, I think he'll be here.
Hopefully people will be so excited to hear from this guy that he'll show up.
Yeah, exactly. So Pat Berarducci is our global fintech lead at Consensus. He's an attorney and a founding member of the Consensus legal team, where he's been directly involved in many client implementations of legal digital assets, from the very early days of ICOs all the way to the current. He consults frequently with regulators around the world to ensure that they are building safe, sane legislation that doesn't stifle innovation. And he's one of the principals behind the Brooklyn Project, which is kind of an open source community focused on helping regulatory bodies do that safe, sane legislation. He currently leads our commerce and decentralized finance products at Consensus, and he's going to join us today to talk a bit about tokenization standards, or the emergence of new tokens, I should say. So in kind of putting this together, and we can go wherever, quite frankly, the chat would like us to go. But I thought it'd be interesting to touch base a little bit on kind of the maturation of Ethereum, enterprise adoption of Ethereum, and maybe a little bit about ETH2 and how that might be impacted. Talk about trends in digital assets and tokenization. Talk about the emerging multi-party business process coordination. We heard a lot about Baseline over the last few hours. And then earlier today in Paul's keynote, he talked about this concept of decentralized finance, creating Lego blocks so you can piece them together into new financial applications. And as these paradigms get developed, we'll be able to do similar things for systems and eventually operations, ultimately making the world a much easier place to compete and join new markets. So while we're waiting for Pat, why don't we go ahead and start with Joe? You have literally seen it all since Ethereum first launched in 2015, Joe. 5 years in this space is an eternity, certainly at the current pace of development. So what are a couple things that have surprised you about where Ethereum is today?
So I guess the fact that it got so big so fast, even though it's not very big and it feels like it took a really long time, it's still there's a bit of a dichotomy in how you perceive things when you're in the middle. And so it is evolving at neck-breaking speed, while many outside see what feels like glacial progress. I think of it not in terms of how things surprise me, but how different elements have stacked up to create some breakthroughs. So for instance, we had a bunch of developer tools and some wallet systems built, and a lot of entrepreneurs and technologists were starting to build really cool stuff. And we had some centralized exchanges, and people were trading these tokens, Bitcoin and Ether. And then somebody put something together, this little standardization element, the ERC20 standard, and suddenly all the wallets and all the exchanges can speak the same language. And it enabled, so I don't think people were necessarily anticipating a revolution in venture capitalization of little projects, but it basically created a massive wave of activity. And there was tremendous benefit that we still retain in that wave. It certainly created some complications too. And so it's pieces like that, how little elements stack up. I think what we're seeing now is a bunch of the elements of DeFi, which is a spectacular revolution in its own right. I think they're about to stack up with this little protocol that you may have heard of called Baseline. And Baseline, we've been bringing enterprise towards the Ethereum technology. And enterprises used Ethereum in private contexts quite a lot. And there have been some examples of usage of Ethereum Mainnet as well over the last few years. But the ability for enterprises or any sort of organization to interlink their agreements and their business processes in zero knowledge, and then tokenize either inventory or use tokenized money or tokenize invoices or other elements of those business processes, and avail themselves of all of the mechanisms of DeFi. I think that's going to be a much bigger revolution than the little token launch revolution we saw a couple of years ago.
Thanks, Joe. A quick question, right? You're seeing all of this evolution, new development. Enterprises are looking more and more closely to Ethereum. Many of them have been using Ethereum for a long time. How can we tell from the outside looking in that enterprises are getting involved, and how are they getting involved?
So we can tell by attending a wide variety of different kinds of EEA meetings, where there are hundreds of organizations that are building out the standards for enterprise Ethereum and using it in different kinds of topical contexts like law and healthcare and many others. We can tell because we work with a whole bunch of enterprises. I'll leave it to Didier to talk about some of the major consortium projects that we've been involved with. And we can tell by looking at the Hyperledger Foundation. Hyperledger Foundation, a while ago, maybe it's about a year ago, onboarded a project called Besu. Besu is Consensus's Ethereum client that is a public mainnet client, but is also fortified with many enterprise enablements, turning it into a real world-class blockchain production system. And it is actually, so the EEA is a sizable organization, and it's had a really big impact on the enterprise Ethereum space or the enterprise blockchain space. But when we contributed Besu into the Hyperledger Foundation, it suddenly gave so many of those organizations, which sort of grew up in their blockchain youth on what IBM was building and selling and messaging. And so we've seen just tremendous excitement and interest in adoption as people in different kinds of enterprises that needed the permission or the imprimatur of something like the Hyperledger Foundation are now diving in and starting to use enterprise Ethereum in the form of Hyperledger Besu.
Can we get some comments from you as to how your clients are using Ethereum today?
Yeah, for sure. So over the past 3 years, so first of all, 3 years ago, we started a consulting business. And over the past 3 years, we've engaged with many clients on use cases across various industries, mostly in particular supply chain, global trade, and financial services. We were involved in large consortia, some of which involving some of the largest banks in the world, and we brought some of those projects to production. And at the time, it was still early stage. You had to build most of the stack from the protocol upwards across architecture layers. So we realized that we were building technical components that were relevant to all use cases, not just the use cases that we were building for our clients. So I think the space matured and we matured with it, and we started building from the ground up our stack, starting from the protocol layer with Hyperledger Besu, and then going up from there with some of our other products in Pegasus and Codify. And in the end, now we are as maturity goes and as we progressed, we ended up reaching the business layers. And so I think it's exciting today to see that all of the stacks that enables enterprise to run business processes, tokenize assets on an Ethereum network is now more mature, more ready than it was before, that it's ever been. And seeing the baseline initiative and the drive towards mainnet is an exciting development in that space, and we're seeing more and more interest from enterprise to use mainnet or at least explore the use of mainnet. And I think
are there certain things? Sorry to interrupt. Are there certain things that mainnet needs to do in order to make it more easily adoptable or safe, if you will, for these enterprises? If so, what are those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think there are very practical things, like it's a user experience topic first and foremost, right? You have a certain block time. You need to pay for gas using ETH. So, you have small practical user experience aspects that we are trying to solve now. In particular via Infura and the concept of a gas station to be able to send gasless transactions to mainnet, for example, and delegate the payment of gas.
That was just a hot topic on the last panel, that's for sure.
Yes, exactly. Scalability and privacy, I think it's getting there. We have our own solutions that in many ways replicate or are a different way to implement the baseline protocol. Our Ethereum client Besu is compliant with mainnet, And we can use off-chain privacy actually on mainnet using Besu with Orion, for example, to guarantee consistency of data across multiple parties. So I think there are small practical problems, but I think they are solvable in the coming year, like few months to 1 year. And then I think it's exciting to see enterprise being interested in mainnet. And I think the network and the technology will be ready for production use cases on mainnet within a year or within a few months, maybe.
Awesome. Pat, thanks for making it. Appreciate you being persistent with the platform. Through your work in the early days of like the ICO Mania and the Brooklyn Project and the Token Taxonomy Initiative, and now, the rapidly growing arena of DeFi and decentralized assets, are there any trends? Joe touched on a couple earlier, but are there any trends that you're seeing from kind of the pilot seat in terms of, broader adoption of digital assets? And what are those trends?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nick. I apologize for the technical difficulty. I've learned to be very persistent in the face of somewhat less user-friendly technology over the last few years. That notwithstanding, I think, I think there's a lot of really encouraging trends. We're seeing just more and more uptick in terms of kind of proving out this hypothesis that that Ethereum, this maximally decentralized open source blockchain technology is a great foundation layer for commercial and financial activity in a variety of ways. And I think just some data points there, just the growth we're seeing in DeFi, permissionless kind of financial lending protocols on mainnet. We're seeing huge upticks in the volume on DEXs, decentralized exchanges. So, protocols allowing people to exchange tokenized representations of value. Big upticks in that. Market caps for stable coins, approaching $10 billion right now. That's, billion with a B. Just really a lot of really great touch points on that. Separate from that too, we're seeing a lot obviously a lot of uptick in interest in CBDCs around the world with various governments. We're also seeing more and more enterprises kind of adopting this approach of basically kind of taking their value chains and moving them from kind of competition to coopetition, so to speak. And that, by leveraging because open source programmable blockchain technology, you can have really, amazing efficiency gains. We've seen, upwards of literally 99% reduction in time to do things like issuing letters of credit and stuff. And that's, that's real use cases with real financial institutions. So, all of these things for such an early industry, I think are really encouraging and just indicative of what's to come.
So you mentioned a lot of financial institutions, certainly some governments, crypto anarchists, DeFi dad. He uses a lot of these things, right? When do you think we're going to see signs of mass adoption, and what could or should be done to help drive that?
That's a great question. I think in some respects we're already seeing kind of more and more retail adoption, just of kind of more or kind of more open finance representations of value. So a lot of people are being drawn to the idea of Bitcoin, Ether, and other kind of permissionless representations of value, especially with kind of all the economic and political and kind of societal turmoil in the world today. It's kind of a beacon of light, so to speak, that I think a lot of people are going towards. That being said, I think we have still a long ways to go. So we really see kind of mass retail adoption. And I think, in order to get there, I think we need to continue doing the things we're doing, which is kind of de-risking both the technology and the use of it. We've learned a lot in terms of what are things kind of responsible and safe key management, how to program and debug, smart contracts, these pieces of code that are literally representing or facilitating the exchange of huge amounts of volume. We're just getting better and better with that type of stuff. And so I think, we're on the right path, and then beyond that, it's, just kind of more education and opening more people up to what's possible. And obviously policymakers and governments too. I mean, continuing to get them comfortable with really the potential here, which, I mean, fundamentally, I think that this enables us to kind of achieve the public policy ends, things like preventing fraud, providing better disclosure, things like that, in ways that are much better, much more effective than previous technologies and systems have ever really been able to do. So I'm very encouraged, obviously.
Yeah, our thesis from very early on was that growth and success of the platform was likely, almost certainly, going to depend on developers. And I think that Ethereum has demonstrated that it's winning by far the bulk of the mind share on that front. Not just in the blockchain ecosystem, but I think even more popularly, it's really starting to make inroads into Web2 communities, etc. So it's all about onboarding developers, making their tools, making their experience, making their incentives strong for essentially exploring lots of different solution domains and bringing the technology to different, more popular mainstream audiences, whether it is enterprise or whether it's consumers. On the consumer front, I think we're gonna see some, I don't know if I would call it breakthrough adoption soon, but probably something really significant in this context of low interest rates, zero interest rates, negative interest rates. As DeFi matures significantly and grows, it's going to drive the value of Ethereum up, which is going to drive growth in DeFi, which is going to drive the value of Ethereum higher, which is going to get more attention, and the bandwidth for this permissionless collateral asset is going to get bigger and bigger, and essentially, I think, drive DeFi exponentially. DeFi is going to be able to, when groups maybe like our own MetaMask, our own Codify, Commerce and Decentralized Finance Group, when we figure out ways to bring yield, interest-bearing savings accounts to average users across the planet with just simple access in their MetaMask mobile wallet, perhaps, I think that's going to be a game changer for a lot of people who either can't establish bank accounts or are sitting with their assets in extremely low yield. And so I think once people see an easy path to making 4% or 8% or who knows, then they'll start to probably use more elements of the decentralized finance ecosystem, so lending or automated portfolio management or something like that. So I think there is a breakthrough to be had in that direction.
This is a question generally for the panel, although Joe, certainly with your background in E2, you may have more to say. Although I would never say that Didier and Pat are short for comments on this stuff. As Ethereum 2 rolls out and staking becomes a viable investment option, essentially, there's been some press that it will cement the future of Ethereum as a store of value. Any thoughts from the panel on that?
I feel like
I think, yeah, Joe, I think it's for Joe. The only thing I would say though is of course, staking is an opportunity for people to put their money in, and it's an opportunity to generate a return, etc. But I think ultimately, what the ETH2 is about is also creating more scalability of the network, and therefore make it mainstream, make its use mainstream, and I think that's more the direction that it will take rather than necessarily making it a store of value.
Yeah, so at the risk of repeating myself, because I answered a similar question thanks, Nick, in an earlier session. I already think of Ether as a store of value. To the extent that Bitcoin is a store of value, Ether is as good a store of value or better. The only difference really in the characterization of the two with respect to store of value is that there are people speaking in the ears of people who want to get exposure to cryptocurrencies, and they're calling Bitcoin gold 2.0, and they're not saying the same thing about Ether. And so people who are, somewhat savvy, but mostly naive, are just buying the Bitcoin rather than buying the Ether. But in terms of the real mechanics, Ether as a staked instrument and other staked instruments both represent a financial asset and mechanism of governance potentially in these platforms. So I think that as we build out a decentralized World Wide Web on which the global economy is increasingly re-architected, these tokens of value, staked or not, but I think most of them are going to be staked because I think those are going to be better, more efficient, more energy efficient systems. I think they are all going to undergird systems for trusted transactions and guaranteed execution of agreements on platforms like Ethereum, decentralized storage on platforms like IPFS and Filecoin, decentralized bandwidth, decentralized identity, decentralized proof of location. So we're going to see the granularization of the IT infrastructure for the planet, and staked assets will be these financial instruments. They will bring immediacy and granularity to our governance with respect to the things that we do on those different interoperating platforms. We'll need financial instruments like futures and options to hedge out our different risks. And it's all going to be a much more seamless infrastructure where the money is married to the governance, which is married to the businesses intimately, much more intimately and fluidly than the financial industry is married to the political machinery, is married to Main Street these days.
Yeah, and I mean, the only thing I'll add to it is I just think, I think proof of stake, and in particular how ETH 2.0 has been kind of constructed, is it's going to do an even better job kind of aligning the incentives of the folks in the Ethereum ecosystem and the participants on the Ethereum network. And I think, if anything, if we learned over the last several years, is that having even stronger aligned incentives between the participants in the network bodes well for the growth and increased value in that network. And I think that it bodes really well for the future of Ethereum.
So, Paul Brody talks a lot about kind of composability and DeFi to decentralized systems, decentralized operations. Some techniques like baseline may actually help you reduce the need for a big upfront consortium, right? Allowing you to build an open blockchain network a little bit more organically. Are you guys seeing clients moving that way, or seeing any indications that that's a possible future?
Yes, I think there are multiple reasons for that. First of all, because one of the learning from I would say the era of private networks, it's not finished, but one of the learnings of the early stage of that period was that private networks tend to create gated communities, and ultimately it becomes a bit of an obstacle to adoption or to wide adoption. And we see certain industries with multiple gated communities that are disconnected or with a fairly thin layer of interoperability. So I think it's becoming, and there's another learning, is the fact that those gated communities have their own infrastructure at the protocol layer, and there's a cost to that as well. And if you combine those two things, I think it becomes quite clear that even though it's a journey, and enterprise will take time to move towards the public infrastructure, it makes sense to avoid gated communities at the protocol layer, share the same protocol level infrastructure, and maximize adoption, lower the cost for everybody, and maximize the number of applications you deploy on that common shared infrastructure, and guarantee interoperability between those applications. That's the logic of it, I think.
You know, one of the things that's interesting about these new conferencing platforms, you know, we've done a lot of them recently, and we have a lot of different formats. And I feel a little bit like Bobby Brady in the Brady Bunch, kind of looking at the squares, and I wonder if it aligns. Like, you know, when I look at Joe, I don't know, you probably don't see that. Anyway, back to the programming. Yeah, so we're probably biased, right? We're in the Ethereum ecosystem. We're very proud of the progress that's been made by the overall community. Are there any final comments that you would share with the audience as to what they should do going forward to get involved?
Well, get involved is exactly what we want to tell them. Basically, if you're an enterprise, you're interested in use cases around business process automation or tokenization of assets, real world or financial assets, then get involved. Reach out to us. At the moment, we are exploring multiple use cases around Baseline, and if you are interested, please feel free to contact us and get involved.
Yeah, if you're a developer, the opportunities are myriad. There are just so many ways to plug in. You can be a Python developer, you can be a Fabric developer, and having some Ethereum chops increasingly is going to enable you to either build Ethereum applications or build some Ethereum connectivity into other applications or other platforms that you care about. Decentralized finance is just going to be explosive. So getting into DeFi as an entrepreneur, as a technologist, come to understand it. It's going to move so fast. There will be trillions or quadrillions of dollars of value created in DeFi. Get in now. It won't be a bad decision. And for enterprises, I would say the same thing for Baseline. This is the start of a whole new way of doing things globally for about 100 years.
Yeah, if I can just add, just quickly, I mean, you know, Ethereum, largest open source programmable blockchain, get involved, start digging in. And if you want help making it easier, you know, reach out to us at consensus.net, and we've got lots of ways to help.
Awesome. Thanks to my panelists for joining me today. Thanks, Kyle, for the opportunity to moderate, and back to you.
Awesome. And thank you all as well. Yeah, thank you guys. There's a lot of comments in the chat, so if you have a few minutes to stay afterwards to our panelists, jump in, and I'm sure everyone would love to hear from you. To you, our audience, thank you so very much. This concludes our Enterprise Ethereum session here at Mainnet 2020, and a big shout out to the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance EEA, the Ethereum Foundation, to Consensus, Microsoft, EY or Ernst & Young, to Codify, to Topio Networks, to Envision, to Unibright, to LimeChain, to Provide, to John Wolpert and the Baseline Protocol, to Carol Geyer at the Oasis Foundation for making so many of the things that they talked about earlier today, a part of Baseline, come together. And last but not least, to Masari and to Brian, to Mason, to Ben, to the entire team that helped us bring all of you together as speakers, to panelists, and our audience as well. Thank you all. I'm Kyle Ellicott of Topio Networks. I'm your host, signing off. Enjoy the rest of Mainnet 2020. Thank you to the Masari team and everyone else. Have a great
Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.